The Witchcraft Trials of Desiree and Gary, a tale of terror and damnation. Gary had always been curious about the supernatural. As a child, he devoured every horror book and movie that he could lay his hands on. As he grew older, his passion for the occult only intensified. He read every book on witchcraft, demons, and dark magic, attended every lecture or workshop he could find, and even dabbled in practicing a few spells on his own. However, as he grew older, Gary realized that dabbling with dark forces was not to be taken lightly. He had heard stories of people who had become possessed or injured themselves because they had not been careful enough. That's why he always made sure to perform every ritual step by step, following all the rules, and never messing with anything he couldn't handle. He knew when to back off when things got too intense. But Gary's fascination with the supernatural never waned, and he always kept his ear to the ground for any new rumors or stories that might satisfy his curiosity. That's how he heard about Desiree. Desiree was a witch, rumored to live deep in the woods that bordered the town where Gary lived. There were stories of people who had wandered too close to her cottage, only to be snatched up and never seen again. However, no one knew the truth, and nobody was brave enough to investigate. Gary, being the curious sort, decided to find out for himself. He studied any map he could find, and eventually found the location of Desiree's cottage. It was a moderate-sized cottage nestled against a hill, surrounded by a dense thicket of foliage. Gary waited for nightfall to approach the cottage, carrying along a few cameras and other recording devices to document his findings. However, as he approached the cottage, he began to feel an eerie sense of foreboding that he had never felt before. Every sense in his body was screaming at him that he should turn back and leave well alone, but he couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. He had been walking for several minutes when he heard a rustling in the bushes behind him. Gary frantically looked around, but all he saw was dense, dark forest, and nothing that resembled human life, at least at first. Just then, a small figure appeared out of the shadows, almost camouflaged in the foliage. It was a small, hunched figure, with long, spindly arms, and blank eyes that stared through him. It wasn't until it opened its toothless mouth to screech at him that he realized that it was no human, but a goblin. Gary turned around and ran, not looking back, his cameras and recording devices left behind. He heard the goblin's screech turn into a blood-curdling scream, but he kept running. Even as he neared the town, he still heard its screams echoing behind him. The next day, Gary could hardly believe what he had experienced. He was still shaken by the events of the night before, but he was even more convinced than ever that he had to find out more. He couldn't rest until he knew the truth about Desiree and the goblin. Over the next week, Gary spent all his free time obsessively researching anything he could find about Desiree and her cottage. He found stories of a darker, more sinister side to her, involving sacrifices and rituals. He even found stories of missing persons all over the area, which were rumored to be linked to her. Taking a deep breath, he prepared to make his move, planning to approach the cottage again in broad daylight. This time he wouldn't be a victim of his own curiosity, but an investigative journalist trying to uncover the truth. As he approached the cottage, he could see the cracks in the walls and the rotting timber of the door. He edged closer, trying to remain silent, and peered in through the window. He saw that the interior of the cottage was just as dilapidated, with old furniture and strange trinkets scattered around. And as if by magic, sudden movement caught his attention. He saw a shadow darting from one room to the other, and he knew that his curiosity had paid off. Turning back to the door, he gently eased it open and slipped inside. The inside of the cottage was dark and dingy, and he had to squint to make out any details. He could smell old herbs and spices, and he knew he was in the right place. As he walked further into the cottage, he realized that it was empty. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. Just as he began to let his guard down, a chill traveled up his spine. A creaking noise broke the silence. He turned to retrace his steps and looked up, heart racing. What he saw took his breath away. Desiree was standing there, flanked by two young girls who looked more like apparitions than real people. Desiree looked ancient, with gnarled bones and patches of papery skin poking out from under her robes. Her eyes were black, surrounded by deep shadows, like two deep wells of darkness. Gary had to swallow hard to keep from screaming. Desiree chuckled, then spoke. "You should have stayed away, young one. You should have never come here." Gary's heart pounded as he stared at the three women. They seemed to be watching him with a dark, menacing interest. Before he could say anything, however, he felt something cold wrap around his ankles. The goblin had come back, and this time it had brought its friends. Gary looked down, and his stomach turned as he saw that the goblin was joined by several more of its kind, all leering hungrily at him. As Gary tried to break free, Desiree began to chant, and the goblins became more agitated. He tried to struggle, but to no avail. They began to drag him towards a dark hole in the floor, and as he looked back at Desiree, he saw her smiling sadistically. There was a final tug at his legs, and he felt himself falling into a deep, dark pit. He screamed as he was sucked into the hole, the earth swallowing him whole. The next morning, a search party found the remains of Gary's camera, but no trace of Gary himself was ever found. Rumors began to circulate that he had come too close to Desiree's home and had paid the ultimate price for his curiosity. Some say that Gary's ghost can still be heard moaning at night, haunting the woods where Desiree lived, and others say that if you listen closely enough, you can hear Desiree's cackles echoing at the same time. Still, others say that if you look closely enough, you can see the goblins watching your every move. Years went by, and the stories of Desiree and her minions of the dark grew in the telling. But for those who knew the truth, there was no doubt that some dark force had claimed Gary's soul. And they all knew not to venture near Desiree's cottage, or else they could suffer the same fate.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and tell us what you think in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe.